respond. You're listening to WOWDLP 94.3 FM, Takoma Radio, streaming live at takomaradio.org. 20 watts of goodwill coming at you from the People's Republic of Takoma Park. Our next guest this hour is Kakali Mitro. She is the founder of the Sramani Institute, an international nonprofit headquartered in Silver Spring. Her institution works to promote well-being and prosperity through diversity in identity, innovation, and practice. She is also the founder of Tapestory, a new initiative in the DC area that has the aim of countering hate and violence in our society through understanding, collaboration, and transformation. Welcome, Kakali.
Thanks very much for having me, Eric.
So why don't we just start out with having you explain a little bit about the Sramani Institute?
Sure. I founded the Sramani Institute about 9 years ago in 2010 in the U.S. And I wanted to create an institution which would use science, policy, law, and compassion to solve what I saw as the 5 major human ecological problems facing us today in the world.
Yeah, and these are days here in the United States and here in the Washington area, of course, when people are feeling a little bit unsettled about life. Of course, in many parts of the world, people feel unsettled on a regular basis. What are the 5 different areas that, and you could maybe explain a little bit about the 5 different areas that you focus on?
We focus on hunger and poverty. That's one area. Another one is environmental degradation. Another one is disease and ill health. Another one is identity loss. And the last one is violence and disenfranchisement. So those all seem to be very different areas, but they are very interconnected in most areas in the world. So we try to solve several of these challenges at once, sometimes all 5 of them together through our initiatives.
So could you give us an example of one of your initiatives and, kind of from how it starts and through whatever it is whatever program that you use to address that concern?
What I wanted to do when I created the Sramani Institute was to create a vertically integrated institution. So we do the research on any issue, we do the analysis, we come up with the solutions, and then we also implement the solutions. And what that does is that it allows both efficiency and it also allows us to have control over any particular issue. So I'll give you an example. We started working with tribal communities in India several years ago, and these communities face a tremendous number of challenges. They face poverty, hunger. They're dying of very, very preventable diseases like diarrhea, sometimes maternal health. They are sometimes almost 100% dependent on government food charity. They have no disposable income to speak of, and they're facing very degraded environments where they live.
And sometimes they've been displaced by public works projects and things like that.
Yes, so unfortunately, I believe the World Bank has estimated that about 5% of the world's population are indigenous communities, and unfortunately many of them have been displaced forcibly by governments or other kinds of agreements or institutions, and they've been displaced from homelands where they've been living for thousands of years. So India is not an exception. Some of the tribal communities in India have been displaced as well. And what we found is that many of the problems come from this displacement. And which is why identity preservation is very important. When people are displaced from their original homelands, they lose their identities as well. They lose their languages, they lose their cultures, but most importantly, they lose their knowledge and technologies. So innovations, economic practices, etc. So our approach, while it sounds very simple now, it took us a few years to develop it, is when we work with these kinds of communities, we basically revitalize their own knowledge and technologies, their own civil engineering programs, their own resource management programs, their own sciences. And then we, in collaboration with governments and local NGOs and corporations, we once again give them or have them have partial access to their resources again in their homelands. And within 6 months to 18 months, they're able to create self-reliant economies once again, and all 5 of these challenges mostly are mitigated through that approach. So our approach is mostly based on revitalizing self-reliance in communities which already had them for thousands of years, but we unfortunately have been taking away that self-reliance.
So you've been working in India. Are there other countries where you put this into practice?
So we haven't yet put this into practice in other countries, but India, as you may know, is sort of like a continent. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to work in 5 geographically very distinct areas in India, so in the south, in the northeast, and in the east. And we did this so that we could develop our methodology and our approach in very, very diverse areas that are culturally, ecologically, and economically distinct. So we are pretty confident that now we've developed an approach that works across cultures, across communities, across ecologies. So now we're set to implement this approach in other countries around the world, and we are really looking forward to starting this in the United States as well.
Mm-hmm. And when did you move to Silver Spring? When did the Institute move to Silver Spring?
The Institute was actually founded in Silver Spring, or in Maryland, in 2010. Before that, we founded the Institute in Canada, and then after that, we founded it in India. So there are 3 autonomously working nonprofit companies working in different countries, and that's for legal and financial reasons. And I moved here just a year before we started this in 2010, so I moved here from New York. Mm. But it's been a fascinating journey so far.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about this? Is it Tapestory? So what is that? And that seems like something that people in the area can immediately get involved with.
Yes, so we wanted to understand how we could translate what we've been developing and doing in India for the last several years here in the U.S. And one of my colleagues and I got together last year, and we were talking about what are some pressing issues in the United States. And even before the election results were out in last November, we realized that one of the most pressing issues is divisiveness in American society, and just misunderstanding the other. And then from the misunderstanding, you can create violence, you can create ignorance, you can create prejudice, stereotyping, exploitation, discrimination. So we wanted to create an initiative based on our work in India, where we would try to counter some of that divisiveness here in the U.S. And we launched it on Martin Luther King Day, actually, in January of this year. And it's been pretty successful, and people are really liking what we're doing so far.
So what exactly does you have workshops? Can you kind of walk me through the events, the activities that are part of this Tapestory?
Right. So there are, I believe now, at least 3 different projects that are associated with the Tapestory initiative, which is still part of the Sramani Institute. It's just our first American initiative. And so it has three phases. So the first is creating understanding between people who are very different from each other. The second is to encourage them to collaborate. And the third is to transform our communities through this understanding and collaboration. And so we've been hosting what we call these eco-cohesion workshops, eco as an inter-community, so a play on eco as an ecological. And what we're doing is we're encouraging people from very diverse backgrounds, whether they're religious or cultural or national origin backgrounds, to come together in a very inspiring space like the Sandy Spring Museum in Sandy Spring, and to explore their differences in pretty interesting and challenging ways, but then also to find common ground. And what we're hoping through these in-depth workshops is to get people to really try to understand each other on a level that I don't think we do usually. And in fact, if you read one of our press releases, one of the people actually commented that he now felt that he knew his table mates at the workshop that he had just met, whom he had just met an hour ago, better and in more depth than he did his work colleagues whom he had known for 10 or 15 years. So we're trying to foster these very in-depth, not just discussions, but explorations of the other, to help people understand that, yes, there may be differences, but they're there for a reason, but that also that people have a lot in common, and that sometimes it's good to focus on what we have in common. And so hopefully get over this fear and xenophobia that people have of each other.
Now, prior to having you come on, you and I spoke a little bit, and we talked about how we don't want to get into politics here, but there very clearly is a political schism in this country. And so I'd be interested to hear a little bit about, how this Tapestory process might help to bridge what appears to be an almost unbridgeable gulf in the United States. I mean, people since the election, and even before have been, talking a little bit of, saying things like, feels like we have two different Americas, feels like I can't talk to family members, it feels like the Democrats and Republicans to, just get right into the political parties don't have any kind of dialogue at all. So is there any way that you're trying to make sure that diversity is also bridging that gap? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, that's a very interesting question and a very complex one, so I will try to answer it in a few steps. I came to this country over 20 years ago, and I've lived in many different countries around the world. I've had that privilege. And I see the world as people having different conceptual frameworks. So a conceptual framework is how you look at the world, how you look at your ecosystem, if you have a religion or a faith, how that's incorporated, what your role is, economics, science, policy, etc., things like that. And for an outsider, this sort of dichotomous political divide that we seem to have in this country does not seem to be such a divide. So for me, it seems as though, if you want to call them Republicans and Democrats, that they both sort of talk about the same thing, but from slightly different angles. So I understand that within the U.S. that seems like a huge divide, but it actually isn't from an outsider's perspective. That's one thing. So what we're trying to do is, so for example, the last workshop we had, we were actually focusing on an issue that might be divided along political lines, and there was role playing involved, and we wanted to see how people would relate to that. So we are focusing on these kinds of seemingly political divides also in our workshop. And at the end of the day, as I said, people seem to understand that they're really not that different. So I think one of the ways to sort of overcome this seeming divide in American society, that this bipartisan sort of divide, is to help people here understand that there are other conceptual frameworks than just the Democratic/Republican framework, just among Americans in this country. It's just that those frameworks are not heard. And so I think that perspective will help people understand that it's not just a dichotomy, it's a whole spectrum. And I'll give you a few examples of what I mean. So Native Americans, for example, have a completely different conceptual framework than the European descendants of the settlers here. And yet, the way we're educated all across the world is essentially a European-American way of thinking about the world. It's a European-American conceptual framework. Many African Americans have a very different way of looking at the world than European Americans do. So, and then of course, Indian Americans and Asian Americans and South and Central Americans, they all also have very different ways of looking at the world. So the sort of the political dichotomy is really just a very small sliver of all of the different ways of thinking and conceptualizing the world. And we really want to help bring that out as well. And I just wanted to add one thing. The reason that's very important to think about living and to think about our lives in terms of conceptual frameworks is that every conceptual framework has a whole spectrum of strategies that you can use to solve economic problems, to solve ecological problems, to solve social problems. And if we only focus on a narrow sliver of a conceptual framework, for example, the European American framework, then we're missing out on all of these other ways of solving the world's problems. And that's partly why I created the Sramani Institute, is to revitalize all of this other diversity, which unfortunately has diminished greatly because of imperialism and post-colonialism.
Well, it seems like the challenge for all of us is to examine what our frame is, that we maybe, I think most of us don't think a whole lot about why we think the way we do. And so you're challenging us to consider that our view is only one view, and it's sounds kind of artificial, really, or cultural, but it's not the point of view.
So I would never call anyone's view artificial. It's just your conceptual framework. Any person's conceptual framework is a result of their culture, their religion, their national origin, the way they've been brought up, their economics, all of these factors. What I do encourage people to do is to be internally consistent. And because, for example, if your views on economics clash with your views on ecology, or your views on capital punishment clash with your views on some other aspect of healthcare, then you are internally inconsistent as a person, and that will harm you in the end in terms of your health, your mental stability, etc. So it's not a judgment on any one conceptual framework or the other. It's about promoting comprehensive and integrated conceptual frameworks, which then can help you fulfill your potential as a person and can help you also see the value in other people. And I just wanted to add one short thing. You asked me what other projects we had. So one of the things we're doing in Tapestory is I now have over 100 hours of audio tape where I've been interviewing leaders of various communities, so people who really have thought about conceptual frameworks. And I have interviewed over 40 different people now just within the DC area. And it's fascinating because the set of questions is the same, but each person gives a different perspective. So I think I've covered most of the faith systems. And I'm also interviewing physicists and economists and ecologists, Native Americans, people from all over the world. And it's exciting to me because just here in the DC area, which I think is a bit over 1 million or 2 million people, we have so many different strategies and conceptual frameworks present, but we don't really talk about them. So I'm hoping the book that I'm up to write based on these interviews will introduce people to other ways of thinking and will also help them create a more integrated conceptual framework for themselves. Because no one is to say that you have to stick to what you know. You can borrow from other people. You can incorporate elements from other cultures. Look at yoga, for example. It's a tool, a technique that's come over from India just a few decades ago, and now many millions of people in the U.S. are trying to engage in yogic practices, and that's something that helps them. So I'm hoping that this book on conceptual frameworks will help people create integrated and internally consistent conceptual frameworks.
And where would people find out more about your work?
So we have 2 websites. One of them is our institute's website, which is Sramani.org, so SRAMANI.org, and the other one is Tapestory.org, TAPESTORY.org. So we have information available on both of those websites. And if anyone wants to email me directly, they can email me at founder@sramani.org.
Okay, so you're listening to WOWDLP 94.3 FM. This is Talk of Takoma. Our guest is Kakali Mitro, and we're talking about the Sramani Institute in Silver Spring. So now one thing I found interesting as I went on your website and looked at some of the work that you're doing is a theme that came up about civilization versus, I'm not sure if you called it civilization versus savagery or what was the, but you talked, for example, about, you mentioned Reza Aslan has a series on religion on CNN, and he, and actually, I usually don't watch that, but I actually happened to catch that when I was in a hotel room recently, and he is exploring different religious traditions. But you seem to you seem to see some friction there in the way he's approaching religion, and the way all of us, I think, or I'm not going to say all of us, but the way some of us approach other religions, other traditions. So I wonder if you would address that a little bit.
So it's very interesting that you bring that up, and if I may just tell you a small story from my own life, it might illustrate it. So as I told you, I've lived in many different countries around the world. I was born outside of India, in Europe, and lived in Europe throughout much of my childhood. And one thing I realized is that I was often the only Indian child among a sea of European children in my schools, and when we went to Japan, it was sort of similar. And often what I would see is that people would denigrate me as a human being because of my skin color and also because of my national origin. And it's something that greatly puzzled me as a child. I was fortunate enough to be born into a family where my parents are very proud to be Indians, and we're actually Bengalis, so we're from the eastern part of India, where a lot of our national movements for independence originated. And so I did not have this kind of inferiority complex that a lot of children unfortunately develop when they are told that you're going to hell, or you're inferior to others, or you have a dirty skin color, or things like that. But it's something that puzzled me already as a child, thinking my ancestors basically made up one of the oldest civilizations in the world that goes back thousands and thousands of years. We have a very sophisticated knowledge system. We've brought the world many, many innovations. And I was wondering, why were they characterizing me this way? And so this notion of savage versus civilized was something that I was exposed to already as a very young person, unfortunately. And I think maybe most children don't have to deal with that. And then, of course, if you read the history of the world, you see this theme coming up over and over again. Europeans continuously calling any country that they were trying to colonize as barbaric or savage. Unfortunately, you even read it in Supreme Court writings in the U.S. from just 100 or so years ago. So, and again, this is all about conceptual frameworks. So if you're from a conceptual framework, which unfortunately does have European origins, where you see yourself as superior to everyone else, and you ascribe that superiority both to your religion, your civilization, your culture, etc., no matter how young that may be compared to other countries' cultures, then you will look at other people, look at other people in terms of hierarchies. And I don't want to comment on any one person or the other, but unfortunately what was going on with, what goes on in many cases with at least descriptions of India and Indians. And by the way, just a tidbit of information, India is actually not a name we call ourselves. It is a name given to us by foreigners who came from the West because they saw the Indus River and they just called us all Indians. So we call our own country Bharat, and we are Bharatiya people. And again, Hindu is not a name given that we use. It's a name that was given to us by outsiders. So this sort of depiction of Indians and, in quotation marks, Hinduism is something, any negative depiction of it, I think, goes back to this sort of European or, unfortunately, Judeo-Christian Islamic superiority over any other type of thinking. And I have to tell you, as a scientist, I'm a biophysicist. I'm also an attorney. I find this divide between faith and faith and science very curious, because in India there is no such divide. In fact, we don't even have a concept of religion. Dharma, as is our way of life, is basically our way of life. And obviously science and empirical observation are an integral way of our life. So, I don't even know how to express myself, but these kinds of very negative and very dichotomous depictions of Indians and of, again, quotation marks, Hinduism, they're completely irrelevant. Whether they're factual or not, I mean, I can't even get to that issue because they're completely not factual. And I just wanted to say, I watched the next episode of Reza Aslan, and that was on, just wanted to say to you, even though the leader's name was Jesus, of that next episode, and it was a cult, which was sort of similar to what he had done in India. He had gone and visited some very obscure cult. He did not mention the word Christianity or Christian even once in an hour-long episode. So it's very interesting that's all I'll say about it, is sort of to equate certain types of people who don't fit into the Judeo-Christian Islamic framework in one way, and other types of people in a different way. And I really am very optimistic that as soon as people start looking at the world through a diverse conceptual framework lens, that they'll stop doing these kinds of things. And also, it's inimical to an entire population of highly educated people in this country. I think there are 3 million Indians here. And I am not the only one who wrote about it. There was an outcry from many, many different people, but unfortunately I don't think there was any response to it. And these kinds of notions sort of make their way into American textbooks, into mainstream depictions of, and unfortunately Indians are not the only people affected. Many, many other types of people are affected.
Well, that's what interests me about your look at that on your website and in the writings that I've seen, which is that only serves as an example, right? And I happen to have caught that particular episode, and I make no comments about Reza Aslan. I just it was an interesting theory. He's going to go and explore different cultures. And as I was watching it, I was kind of wondering, seemed to be making a spectacle rather than actually getting to a point of understanding. And I think that's something that as we look at moving forward here in the United States and in the world and trying to make the planet a better place, it seems like we need to try to understand each other better. And it seems like that's what you're trying to do with the Institute and with the Tapestory.
Can I add one
Yes.
thing? So it's interesting that you brought up this depiction of Hinduism, again, in quotation marks, but I also wanted to add that in terms of civilization and savagery, there's another distinction that we make a lot. We make distinctions between urban communities and rural and tribal communities. We also make distinctions between what part of the world you're in, and these kinds of distinctions are not useful. So, for example, to call one technology high-tech and another low-tech, or to call something traditional knowledge and another thing science, or to call something superstition and another thing, analysis or empirical observation. These are very not useful ways of looking at different knowledge systems. So I don't use the word science even though I am a scientist, to describe different people's technologies and practices, different communities. I call them knowledge and technology systems, and that's to sort of equalize the way we look at people. So I'll give you a very small anecdote. I've been telling people this anecdote for several years now, that we went and worked with a community in India who has the knowledge of how to stabilize climates. So they have the knowledge of how to make it rain, right, by manipulating the root systems of groves of trees. And I am met with one of two reactions when I tell the story. Either people start laughing, and when I tell the story to urban people, no matter where it is, in India, US, Canada, wherever it is, either they start laughing and they start ridiculing me, even though I am a scientist, and then also the community, or they don't say anything, but I'm pretty sure that they're doing that in their heads. And this is a problem, because if you think about the fact that we can transmit radio waves, or we can transmit television across the world, nobody is sort of scoffing at that and saying, well, I don't believe that. But people are scoffing at technologies just because we don't have them as urban populations. So this is what I mean by conceptual frameworks. It's really unhelpful to put different communities and different countries in a hierarchical system. This is also the reason I don't use the word developed versus underdeveloped or developing. What does that even mean, right? So if you call India developing versus the United States developed, what does that mean? The United States, in its current form, has only been around for a few centuries. India has been around for thousands of years. So how is India less developed than the United States? So these kinds of hierarchies are very unhelpful, and I'm hoping that through our work at the Sramani Institute, we help not only the public, but also decision makers and other kinds of people see the value in different kinds of people, not as a condescension, but as actually, oh, you understand something I don't, I will put you on an equal level as I put myself. So there are so many different barriers that we need to get over, and we have just started our work, so I just wanted to add that.
Sure. Well, your mission statement says that your mission is to secure for all human beings in their unique ecological, cultural, and economic context the rights of self-definition, personal liberty, respect, and a dignified existence. You mentioned earlier that there are common needs, common desires that people have, and it seems like you're trying to address that with the vision here, that we think that we have these divisions, but we actually have, we're all looking for the same things in life. I wonder if you would comment a little bit about what that is, because you also talk a little bit about like relieving suffering, and that's really, the overall goal.
So that's an excellent question, and one of the reasons we are confident that our work in India will translates very well over to our work in the United States and other countries is that the one common desire that all human beings have is to be self-reliant. And that does not seem to be a general concept that people have, especially if you look at our inner cities here or at very poor people. A lot of people, not everybody, a lot of people seem to think that they want to be on social welfare, or that they want to have charity, or they want to be dependent on something, whether it's a government or something else. But through our work, and this was just a hypothesis before we started our work, through our work we have seen that individuals and communities, they want to be self-reliant. They want to rely on themselves, and they want to feel a sense of accomplishment and say, look, we don't need anybody else's charity. Charity is a very degrading kind of concept if you think about it, really. I mean, if someone gave me money, not in exchange for work or my knowledge, I would feel very degraded. And that is what we do to a lot of different kinds of people, not just in this country, but throughout the world. So our main focus, one of our main focuses through the Sramani Institute's work is to bring that dignity to people. And often it's highly marginalized and disenfranchised people who are suffering that indignity, not because they want to be in that situation of dependence, but because maybe they haven't had the opportunities, or they haven't been given resource access, or their identities are not being taken seriously. This is a very different approach that we're trying to take, and this is why it's a little bit challenging to help people understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. But you see remarkable results. If you listen to a community that is not listened to, whose voices are not heard, a completely disenfranchised community, whether it's here or in India or South America or in Africa, wherever, they are so exhilarated, and you can draw out their creativity within a matter of hours if you just give them respect. And that is our main approach, is that we go and work with these people whom many people have just written off, especially governments in many cases, and we give them respect, and we encourage them, we infuse self-confidence into them, and then they come up with amazing solutions to their own problems. And then a little bit of what we also do is we facilitate resource access, and we facilitate, negotiations and dialogues, but in effect, they are self-reliant, and we just help them achieve that self-reliance. So this is a very different model than what many sort of people are thinking about, and I guess if I had to talk about one common element, that would be it, is people want to have dignity.
And I know you have some of those stories up on your website. So how can our listeners get involved with the Sramani Institute?
Here in the U.S., they can get involved in the Tapestory initiative, and if they just go to the website, reach out to me again, founder at sramani.org, or tapestory at sramani.org. They can get involved in our workshops and in helping overcome diversity here. So that would be through work and through collaboration with us. Another way they can help us is to donate money to us or resources, because we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we did get a National Geographic grant for our work in India, and we're applying for more grants, but we're just about to start our next fundraising campaign. So that's another way that people can help our mission.
Okay, and then one last time, can you spell Sramani?
Yes, Sramani is spelled Sramani, and our website is sramani.org, and our other website is tapestory.org. And we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, but I have to admit I don't know how to use any of these social media, so we're doing the best we can.
Well, thank you for coming on Talk of Takoma, and I hope we'll have you on again. Let's keep in touch, and maybe there are some ways we can collaborate. Of course, I'm very interested in learning more about your stories, and maybe how, maybe we can bring some of those stories onto the radio. That'd be fantastic.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Eric.
Okay, thank you.